Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first in our series of LinkedIn Live sessions, following on from the Inspiring Global Workforce Innovation Summit that was held in London in May now. Gosh, I can't believe we're nearly into August. The summit sparked some really great conversations about the future of work, and we're really all committed to keep that momentum going. And so today we're going to start with these kind of continuing conversations, looking at the critical intersection between leadership and mental health and business strategy. And one of the things that the summit highlighted was the really pivotal role of transparency in fostering a healthy and productive workplace. So we're going to be speaking to three of the speakers from GWIS. We're going to talk to Jen Congdon, and we're going to talk to David Beanie, and we're going to speak to Teresa Reynard. So I think we have two of them already here, so we'll get them to join us. David, I think you're here, and Teresa, hopefully you'll be up and on the screen in a second, and we can start chatting with a little bit of a pre-chat beforehand. So we've already got the conversation going, so I want to make sure I cannot see any of you. So there's just me waffling at the moment, which will be good when you do join us, because you're a lot more intelligent than me when it comes to talking about workplace innovation. So I'm hoping that any minute now we will have David and Teresa joining us. Are you there? Are you there? It's me just shouting into the ether at the moment. I think, let me tell you a little bit about who's joining us then. So David, who is coming up. No, I'll start with Teresa because she's actually here. Hi, Teresa. Nice to not be alone over here. Hi. So Teresa is the founder of 4C, and she also was the CEO of several organizations. Is that right? COO even. So she's got quite a lot of experience, and she spoke at GWIS on finding everyone's place and making innovation stick, which was a really interesting conversation about how to get people to come along with you. David carried out a workshop for us, David Beanie, around mental health, which still sticks with me to this day. I think I still got my can of beans, David, on my desk. And he is the founder, obviously, of Breaking the Silence Limited. So he's a counsellor, mental health consultant, spent your career in the corporate world. And you were talking to us about managing your mental resilience during challenging times. And we're also waiting for Jen Congdon, who is from a background, really long background in human resources. She was the chief HR officer for the M Financial Group. I think she still is indeed, and owned the HR consulting firm L2C. So we'll wait for Jen. We started to talk just now because it's transparency that came up as a key kind of issue that holds organizations back. And obviously you've both got different angles from this. So maybe I'll start with you, David. We talked about it's being honest with your organizations has so much of an impact.
Absolutely. The tone has to come from the top of organizations when it comes to creating a kind culture that's genuinely focused on mental health and well-being. Without doubt, employees realize when senior people are just ticking a box. We were saying just now, the three of us, there's still many senior leaders who really struggle with sharing vulnerability. They still think they've got to be sort of show strength every day at work and make out their Superman or Superwoman. Yet it's proven that you're more likely to take people with you these days when you're authentic and when you're transparent. The great news, Claire, is that more and more senior leaders are realizing that things have changed about leadership in the last 10, 15 years that does allow leaders now to be authentic, be transparent, be their true selves. Teresa, you made some great comments just now about, you'll word it better than me if you don't mind coming in, about what the real value of them being transparent.
Yeah, and I think, for me, if you look at it from driving change and taking people on a journey, then when the leader pretends that they know all the answers and they don't, the organization assumes that that there's something secretive and assumes that, you know, people are up to no good or that there's negative things going to happen. So by being vulnerable and actually standing up and saying, here's what we're doing and here's where we haven't figured it out yet, then people can relax and say, okay, it's not that I'm getting information because it's bad and they don't want to tell me or that they're hiding it. It's that they don't know and I just need to wait and see. And when they know, then they'll tell me. And so everybody relaxes. And also it means that people feel that their voice matters. So if you're sitting there with a great idea of what the company should do, and they say we haven't got it figured out, it allows you to step forward and to put your 2 cents worth in and say, well, actually, I've got an idea. So it means you're not just a cog in the wheel, your voice matters and you can get involved. And what that means then for companies is the richness of all those ideas come forward. And some of them are going to be gold dust.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, look, Jen has joined us now, and we've gone a bit about face, which is, you know, that's fine. We were going to start with asking you, Jen, all about your experience, and then and you know, around that topic of transparency. But we sort of kicked it off a little bit there, and I think you heard a bit of what was said. It's that kind of it's a confusion. It's almost like businesses need to show their vulnerabilities as well as the people leading it need to show their vulnerabilities. That true transparency. So let's bring you in now. I mean, where do you stand on this? How do you experience it, or how have you experienced it?
From a vulnerability perspective, we'll start with this morning coming to our building in Portland, Oregon, and finding out that none of the doors open. So I hooked it up 9 flights of stairs, and I'm dripping with sweat. So, but I made it in. It's all good.
Well done.
No, vulnerability is you know, it's pretty relevant, obviously, from all of our employees' perspectives. I think vulnerability from a leadership perspective, when we present ourselves in a way that is humble and transparent, right, that we're able to bring more engagement from our employee population, right, by sharing our stories and sharing who we are and what we're about and where we failed and where we've been successful. And I've certainly seen a lot of different leaders over the course of, you know, my 30 odd years in human resources present themselves in a variety of different ways and showing up in a variety of different ways.
So are they most effective to you when they are transparent, or is there a sort of degree where you could hide some of it?
You know, I think that when people are more transparent, when leaders are more transparent, the organization rallies around that. You know, I've seen so many instances. I mean, I'll give a couple of examples, right? So I've had the benefit of working at companies like Cisco Systems, like Honeywell Aerospace, and so you have these epic, I'll call them epic leaders for very different reasons, right? You had John Chambers from Cisco Systems who would walk into a room, command like complete respect out of everybody that's sitting around him, and you know, people know that what he says is going to be true, it's going to be genuine, and the business results certainly follow that, right? And so he was able to, you know, be 100% himself in that moment. And he, you know, I think there are plenty of stories on Mr. Chambers around growing up dyslexic, right? Overcoming a lot of different obstacles throughout his career to be a very successful CEO, and him putting himself out there and sharing those stories with his employees, right, really got more people, you know, enthusiastic and wanting to do more for him than I think some other leaders, you know. And then I'll contrast that with like a Dave Cody from Honeywell, right? Very different personality, you know, very direct and also completely transparent. I mean, I'll give a little bit of an example. I was sitting in a town hall in our Minneapolis facility. This was many decades ago, right? But I think it's so relevant today. And one of the union employees were like, "Hey, Mr. Cody, what are you going to do to save our jobs?" And he just turned around and he looked at that employee and he was just like, "What are you going to do to save your job?" Right? And you could imagine like the quiet that kind of fell over the audience, but it's a real question. So how are we going to show up every single day? It's 100% in our control, right? And for him to say that back to those employees, that site, that particular location had a banner here that year, because they're like, you know what, you're right. If we deliver high quality products, if we are present for our customers, if we're delivering on what we say we're going to do every single day, then we don't have to worry about our jobs, because our jobs are going to be there for a really long time.
When you say that, I just wanted to ask you, David, like that's only going to work, isn't it? That kind of question from an employer who's already shown that he's, shown his true colors and shown his authenticity, isn't it? Otherwise, they would not have turned around. They'd have all been furious.
No, absolutely. And what I'd like to share is, I've done a lot of work with the military in the UK, and you can imagine trying to get senior military figures to share vulnerability has been so alien to them within their culture. And I met someone very senior about 7 or 8 years ago who shared with me very privately about what he referred to as his mental breakdown. And he shared the lengths he went to cover it up, and the lengths the Royal Navy went to cover it up. Well, fast forward a few years, and he shared a stage with me, and in front of hundreds of military personnel, he talked to them about his mental health breakdown. And I've never seen so many grown men cry. And after that talk that day, was he suddenly seen as a weak link in the Navy? Not at all. He's now seen as a more inspirational leader. And linking it with mental health as well, and not just business results. We all know in military across the world, they have a very high rate of suicide because there's such a macho culture that men particularly find it really difficult to open up and admit when they're struggling. Well, when senior leaders in the military can share their vulnerability and when they're having tough times, what they do is they give everybody else permission to be their true selves too, by saying, look, it's okay not to be okay. We all have tough times. So without doubt, this transparency and being authentic and vulnerable isn't a soft subject. This isn't going fluffy. This is about I think it's the only way you optimize business performance, because you only get the best out of people when they can be their true selves at work. And secondly, in terms of looking after people's mental well-being across the world, unless people feel safe to put their hand up and say when they're struggling, we're going to lose people to suicide and lose people to serious mental health. So this isn't a fluffy subject at all. Not at all. Thank you, Claire.
Teresa, I wanted to ask you, because you were saying that when you showed vulnerability as a leader, it was probably when you got the biggest kind of the most impressive amount of support, but also buy-in to what you were doing.
Yeah. And I can think of two times. I mean, one was during COVID, and I was in Singapore when COVID started. And of course, it started in Asia. And so we had no playbook to go by, other than luckily myself and my head of health and safety had also lived in Asia through SARS. So we had a little bit, but the world had changed a lot and it was very different. And I remember getting my leadership team around the table. So I called everybody in. We had 12 people sitting around the table, and I kind of laid out the problem. And one of my greatest team members said, "So what's the plan?" And I went, "I have no idea. But we've got 12 smart people around here, and we're going to figure it out. And when we leave, we're going to put the plan into effect. And tomorrow we're going to come back and we're going to say, is it working, or do we need to pivot?" And that's kind of what we do on a daily basis. As soon as I said, I don't know, rather than them all panicking, everybody almost sat up and rolled up their sleeves and was like, right, okay. And then, everybody gets into solving the problem. And literally, we had 12 really great brains around the table, and everybody got engaged on putting forward their speciality, but also just their opinions and their work and their effort, because they knew that it would matter. It wasn't like, well, there's no point, I should sit back because it's all figured out. So that was one. And then the other one was my son had a mental health breakdown during COVID very badly, and ended up in a mental health hospital for a while. And I was trying to be the CEO at the time and keep all of this a secret. And so I'd be on like big global calls and even client calls, and I'm like trying in the other ear on the other phone to talk to the psychiatrist at the hospital and things like that, because everything, when it had to be done now. And as you know, when you're trying to fit in with doctors and specialists, you're working to their timetable, not to yours. And so it was causing a huge amount of stress. And I knew that I was being late for client meetings and I was just not showing up the way that I wanted to, and it wasn't me. And so I actually got my leadership team around and I said, look, here's what's going on. I wasn't going to tell you, but I kind of need to. And the first one jumped in and said, right, you do what you need to do and we're going to cover for you. So if you don't show up on time for a meeting, we will assume that that's what you're busy doing and we'll just take over and it was absolutely fabulous. It allowed me to do what I needed to do. It took the stress off, which meant I performed better. And also it allowed my team to step up, which, you know, is empowering for them. So it really like gelled us as a team. And it took me days to decide to tell them. Like I was really worried that when I told them, everybody was going to say, oh, wow, you can't separate work and family and you're falling apart and whatever. But it had the opposite effect.
And Chris, isn't that amazing? You know, if you think about sometimes as leaders in the organizations, we put so much more stress and pressure on ourselves that, you know, you have to be perfect. You have to be there. You got to be present. You can't miss a step. You can't miss a beat. And when you do, knowing that clearly in this case, right, clearly your leadership enabled your employees to say, you know, we've got this, we can do this, and we're going to do this, and we're very capable, and we've got to have her back, right? And I think it's okay for us to take a pause, take a breath, and say, you know, we're not the smartest people in the room, right? All the time, and we want to surround ourselves by those that are.
Yeah. It does raise a question, though. Oh, I was just going to say, I wanted to bring some of the questions people have been saying, some of the points they've mentioned, which was one thing that kind of, it's only going to work if you're a good leader yourself when you show that vulnerability, because as Letitia said here, you know, she's ended up seeing staff celebrate when their boss goes through a hard time, because if they've not been a good boss, they've not been a good leader, then always showing that vulnerability, you can see why they don't want to show it. Now, there was also a question from Cheryl, which is, there's research showing there's a penalty for female leaders who show vulnerability and male leaders receiving a lift. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think it might be, again, about like, how good of a leader are you? What's your relationship with your team? And how do you then react with that, right? So, you know, in that last example I gave myself, when I had to miss something and one of my team would phone me and say, okay, here's what you missed. And the first thing they'd say is, how are you? Right? Here's what you missed. And then what I was doing is feeding back saying, that's awesome. You know, this person has stepped up. Why don't you lead that for us? I actually got to understand and recognize the strengths of some of my team as they kind of stepped into almost mini succession for me in periods. So I think it's also what you do with it. Do you just lay it out there, or do you actually reward and recognize people who are doing great things as they step up and as they help and support?
So just giving, sorry, Jen.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, over the years, being a man, I do lots of talk about men's mental health, and we talk about how it's harder generally for men to share vulnerability because of their macho-ness. However, every day has been a school day for me in recent years, and I've listened to many senior female executives share with me that because they're female, when they get to a senior level, it's equally exceptionally hard for them to share vulnerability because too many men around that table are waiting for them to fail and show that they're not macho in a way. So whereas I would have thought myself 5-6 years ago that for men it's much harder to be vulnerable, I've changed my mind. I think it's difficult for men and women and whatever gender we are to share vulnerability, particularly when you're sitting around a board table and at a senior level.
There's different things will hold different people back. Jen, I know one of the things you wanted to say was, you know, people are talking, organizations talking about, yeah, we're authentic, yay, we're transparent, we're all these great things, but it's not true, is it? Half the time, it's just a word. It's like greenwashing. It's like we're authenticity washing. So I know that was an issue you'd raised before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of times that words are hollow, right? And when we throw around words like authenticity and, you know, enablement, empowerment, transparency, engagement, all of these different words that if they're not demonstrated right from the very beginning, it's gonna completely fall flat, right? And so how is it that you're showing up and, you know, are you bringing them to life in a really exceptional way, and is it coming from a really good place, right? So when you think about being authentic, and I'm like, just be yourself, right? That word has so much baggage with it right now. But I think that if you really show up, and when you're talking to your employees, when you're talking to your peers, if they know that the feedback that you're providing is coming from a good place, only good things are going to happen, right? It's when it's not that it turns on its head. You know, there have been multiple times, you know, that I think about over my career where I've had leaders show up in a variety of ways, and I'm sure I've showed up in a variety of ways, you know, as you mature and progress throughout your life. But I've always been of the mindset that feedback's a gift, right? You can't do anything with it if you don't have it. Then it's 1000% a personal choice. And even like if you look at my LinkedIn banner, you'll see my German Shepherd Fredo up there that says, you know, hey, feedback's a gift. Now what do I do with it? Right? And I think it's incumbent upon us as leaders to also help our employees know what to do with it. And you know, I found that when you really show up and you're present, you're in the moment, and you're having that engaging conversation, you're talking to them about it's not about them, right? It's not about the person, it's about the problem, right? And what are we trying to solve with this problem? And how do we help them get there along that way and along that journey?
And I would say, you know, it comes back to that old phrase that I think is still tried and true, which is walk the talk. So if you're telling your people that it's okay to be vulnerable, if you're telling your people that this is a company that supports mental health rather than penalizes it, then you need to walk the talk. Otherwise, people are always suspicious and thinking it's just a trap, right? And the other thing I wanted to pick up on is, you know, we're talking about being vulnerable. Doesn't mean you're being weak, right? Vulnerable and weak are not the same thing. You can be vulnerable and you can smash it in the boardroom and go head to head with anybody else in there and win. But you're vulnerable about an issue or about something. And I think that's something that's really important to the audience to notice. Vulnerable and being weak.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, Carol.
No, I was just going to say, I totally endorse that being vulnerable is not being weak, and equally being kind to your staff is not being soft. A phrase that I've really got to talk about in recent years is that throughout most of my career, I was trying to raise the bar. About 7 or 8 years ago, I decided to lower the bar. And what I mean by that is I'm not lowering my standards. I'm not lowering my aspirations. I'm being kinder to myself. Now, when you lower your own bar, two things should happen. One, you bring down your levels of stress because you're not being so demanding on yourself. And secondly, you should achieve more as well. This is the thing that many people don't get, because when you operate in a more relaxed kind of state to yourself, you get greater clarity of thought. And when you have greater clarity of thought, you tend to get more things done. You become more productive, you become more creative. And this is why, as leaders, if we can sometimes in our organizations lower the bar, be kinder to people, you'll actually drive productivity forward, because you're creating an environment that will just get more things done. Just endorsing what Teresa was saying. This isn't a fluffy subject. We're not talking about going soft and weak here. We're actually talking about having courage and being brave and to be vulnerable. It's not easy, but you're actually going to.
One of the things I wanted to raise, and indeed Cheryl has raised it here, she said there's authenticity at an individual level of analysis, and then there's the transparency at an organizational level. And she says they're probably only mildly correlated, but it plays into that whole thing. If your organization is transparent and not necessarily vulnerable, but if they say, we don't know this, like I was saying before, I've hosted events for people who are having mergers, and they say, we're going to do a town hall, and we're going to, and there's two kinds that you do. There's one when they say, we're going to sit on the stage and we are going to take the questions, and we are going to say, we don't know that yet. And I know you're worried about whether you'll still be able to homework. And I know that you made a decision when you bought your house last week before you knew about this at the mortgage. Just going, we can't answer all your questions. We're being honest. We're still figuring them out. And then there's the ones who go, we don't have any of those answers, so we're not going to take any of those questions. And it ends up being this sort of very show, it's a very kind of celebrity show thing, that when they all come on and they smile and they wave and they pretend they're all great friends, and it's so scripted, and I know it's scripted. Literally, I'm reading off auto cue, it's that bad. So I was just wanting to say to you, Jen, what do? How can you kind of make it transparent in the business, like that, the business vulnerability? How can you show that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're honest, right? You be honest and you be transparent and you do take those questions and you take the difficult questions. And if you don't know the answer, you don't make it up, right? So let's start with that. Let's don't sugarcoat something, right? I mean, there are a lot of really challenging situations that are out there. And I think it's incumbent upon us as leaders in the organization to circle back, and once we have an answer, that we're sharing that answer, and we let them know that we're going to do this, and we let them know that we're going to do it in a timely manner, right? It's not falling on deaf ears. So there's nothing worse than like asking for feedback and asking for questions and then not acting on it, right? It's kind of a good part of my background is all around continuous improvement, and that's one way that organizations, I think, can really show transparency. So you're either on track or you're off track. If you're walking a factory, I'm going to use a manufacturing analogy. If you're walking a factory floor, you should be able to tell, like, within 10 feet in 10 seconds if you're having a good day or you're having a bad day, because it's right in front of you. You're green or you're red. And if you're red, that's not a bad thing, right? That tells you, what resources do I need to pull in from other areas to solve this problem so we can get back on track. And I think that sometimes is where organizations can fall short, where they're not rallying their employees to come help solve the problem, where they're trying to say, oh my God, we're red today. My manager's going to get really pissed, excuse my language, and my boss's boss is going to get really pissed. So let's just cover this up and let's just say that we're green, right? And that's completely counterintuitive to the type of culture that you want. And I found, migrating more into like services space outside of manufacturing, and even in the functional spaces, we can do so much more around kind of applying some of those lean principles, because it's such a great engagement opportunity. You're getting great ideas from the people that are doing the work every single day, and you've got a lot more. I think anymore, right? The manufacturing environment really understands continuous improvement, and they know lean and they know Six Sigma. The back office, we're getting there, right? Agile is coming around, kind of the lean version for the back office, but there's so much opportunity for that transactional process improvement, and it's such a great way to engage your workforce and to share with all of your employees exactly how we're performing and how we're doing, because they can see it. It's in front of them every single day, and they can ask those questions real time.
David, you had something to say.
Yeah, where I find many businesses fall short, let's say, for example, they have 5 key senior leaders. There's probably one of those senior leaders who's an old-fashioned bully. You wouldn't want to work for them personally. The business knows it. It becomes an elephant in the room, but they never deal with it. So the reason sometimes you get different views on the same business is, if you work directly for that person, you won't say great things about that company. Whereas if you work for one of the other 4, you may say, we've got a fabulous culture here. We are authentic as a business. But so many senior leaders say to me, David, I do really want to embrace your stuff. I want to have a kind culture. What do I need to do? And I say to them, look, you know what you need to do. You've got one senior person who you wouldn't want to work for. They are a bully. They've been here for years. I know they do a pretty good job in many ways, but you'll never achieve the culture you want while they're still in the business. But many of them don't actually deal with it. They leave that person in situ and nothing ever changes. Thank you, Claire.
No, I think we've all seen that. Teresa, I hadn't come to you for a while, and there was a really great question here, which I thought was good for you. It's in situations where the leadership styles are differing, what is the best approach to get those who are guarded and resistant to it to become a little bit more vulnerable and to be a bit more open? What have you seen?
So I've seen people actually ask for help and support. So I've actually seen a couple leaders where they've received feedback that kind of told them those messages. It was always anonymous feedback. A lot of companies do those employee engagement surveys and things. And I actually saw somebody who was wonderfully brave, who kind of said to their team, I've received this feedback. I'd like to do something about it, but I kind of don't know. And I don't know if what I do will work or not. So I'm asking for all of you to tell me when you see it working and tell me when you see it not working. And so actually, and they said that to their whole team. What they then did was also went and picked a couple of people, not all at the same level. Like, you know, one of the people was their PA, right? Because they were close enough. They thought they might get some honest answers from that person. There was a couple of others when they said, when this is what I'm trying to work on, when you see me doing it, tell me, so that I know that the changes I'm making are working and I can continue. When you see me failing, just, you know, you don't need to make a big deal about it. Just take me aside and privately and say, you're doing it again, right? You said you wanted to stop that. And so I think that we're not always the most objective people of our own behavior, right? And we can't always see ourselves the way other people see us. So asking for help, whether that be to a big group or just to one or two people who you trust, is a great way to try and facilitate that change.
Teresa, it's so funny that you say that. You know, I had a couple of leaders at a former organization where it was pretty high ego, right? And you know, one of the first days, like during my interview process with the company, one of the leaders asked me, he's like, "Well, are you going to give me feedback?" Right? And I'm like, "Well, do you want feedback?" And he just like thought about it for a minute. And he's like, "Well, yeah, I do want feedback." I'm like, "All right." And so then after I got hired and I started, you know, I observed a couple of different meetings and I was watching what was happening. And, you know, I knocked on his door and I was like, "Hey, you know, so when you interviewed me, you asked me if I would give you feedback. I'm like, do you really want it?" And he looks at me and he's like, I think so, right? He's like, "Yes." I'm like, "So how do you think that meeting went?" Right? And went into this very kind of Socratic questioning of asking, what did he observe? What did you see that was happening in the room? Did you see people crossing their arms? Did you see people kind of like rolling their eyes at what you were saying? And he hadn't noticed that, right? And so then after that, whenever we were in meetings, we kind of like we're doing the little, you know, for American baseball, like, all right, here's a sign, you know, do this. Pay attention to the room and our baseball signals to kind of give him real-time feedback on that. But it took so much courage for him to actually receive the feedback and put himself in a very vulnerable state of saying, okay, I guess I did say this before. Now I need to put my words with my actions and listen. And he's gone on to become, you know, a really well-respected CEO in different companies over the last, you know, decade or so. But it was really fascinating, and I think having those confidants, having those people that you can, you know, have their, you know, you can have their back in that situation, and really being candid and forthright and transparent. It goes back to the earlier comments of it's coming from a really good place, and you know, and I think people receive that just so much better that way.
In both those cases, though, that you've mentioned, there was some vulnerability expressed from the leader by saying, "I know I need help," or "I want the feedback." I guess what do you do if there's not a history of that within the business? I mean, I think my daughter works for a startup, and every Monday you have a meeting with your, I don't know, I can't remember the term, but with your buddy when you check in on the personal stuff as well, so that someone else in the organization is aware. You don't have to share it, but they're aware if you're going through some difficulties or if you've had a terrible weekend. There's a kind of just a known to check in and share, and then there's a 360 feedback all the time. They have to get feedback from different people in their business when they want promotion, all that kind of thing. So it's very common and normal for them. So as they rise through the organization, they'll be used to it, but then they'll go to an organization where their boss didn't do it. So what do you do then? David, your hand was up.
Yeah, just a halfway house, if you like, for senior leaders not prepared to share vulnerability. I was at the IOD in London a number of years ago, the Institute of Directors, and the guy on stage said to all the senior leaders in the room, when you go back to your boardrooms, if you're serious about this topic and embracing mental health in the workplace, I want you all to share your own mental health story. And as he said that, he said, look, I know at least half of you are thinking, well, I haven't got a mental health story. He then said, bullshit. He said, somewhere it will have impacted your life. It may not be about you, It may be about your partner, your best friend, your next door neighbor, but share it, talk about it. So if at first you can't talk about your own vulnerabilities, if you start talking about where it's touched your life, you're still giving other people permission to share this sort of stuff too. So it's just a halfway house for some senior leaders to start talking about vulnerability. And just another thing while I'm talking, I think with senior leaders who aren't prepared, who think this is a fluffy subject, we need to change the language around this topic. What I mean by that is that one organization I was working with, I think I can name them, a travel company, TUI. I was initially going into their senior team to do a session about mental health. And one of the senior leaders at the time said, let's change the name of the topic from a mental health masterclass to driving energy through TUI. And that's what he did. And the reason we did that is because suddenly all the senior people in the room associated the topic with actually driving performance through the business and not just the ultimate topic of mental health. So I think sometimes we can change the language around this topic to get more senior leadership buy-in as well.
Thank you. We're getting feedback. I think somebody has, maybe if we put ourselves on mute when we're not talking, that might prevent the feedback a bit. Who was going to speak then? Was it you, Teresa? Go for it.
Yeah. I think I totally agree. I think that sometimes nomenclature is really important. The other thing I was going to say in answer to that question is, not all of the leaders in the organization will be of the same ilk normally. So if you have a leader who's not open to maybe being a bit more transparent or vulnerable if they need to, then you might have somebody like Jen who, is able to kind of take them aside and say, do you want feedback? And I love, Jen, that you kind of prefaced it with that question, because I think that creates a safe space, because it's very scary to give somebody feedback or to ask them to behave differently if you think that it might have some blowback, right? So I think that by prefacing with, do you want to know? When they say no, then there's kind of nothing you can do. But if they say yes, they then kind of have to take it. So what they do with it is very different. But I think that, if the person themselves isn't aware or isn't of that kind of personality, then sometimes that's the courage that the rest of us as leaders need to take, which is to go up to one of our peers or leaders and say, I kind of need to talk to you about something. Right? And I love the way that you did it.
That is it's so great that you brought that up, right? So, I think about my role as a leader in human resources, right? And I think about some of my peers that are on the C-suite. And I know for me, I can be one conversation away from not having a job, right? So you provide that feedback to a CEO, you provide that feedback to a chairman of a board, you provide that feedback to someone else, and you catch them on that day that they don't want to hear that feedback. Like, oh, okay, that could have been a career limiting move, but it's my responsibility, right? I have an accountability to myself, I have accountability to the team, and I have an accountability to the organization, right? To share that, no matter how intimidating sometimes that can be. It's an interesting dynamic for sure. You're on mute, Cliff.
Yeah, so was on mute. The guys have been talking in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it. They've been talking about the Deloitte's 2023-2024 Human Capital Trends Report, and where trust was the word, is basically the new workplace currency. And there's a report apparently by Gallup that high trust outperforms low trust by 186%. So it's yes, it's changing the words to say human, whatever you want to use, rather than mental health health in the workplace, whatever, that will get people there. But once you start talking about it being the actual difference between business success and not, that's when you'll get that immediate switch. The problem with so many people is they're stuck in that way where they don't see the relevance to them. If they're at the other end of the business, they're very senior, they're looking forward to retirement with lots of money and moving on. They don't see the need for the change, do they? David?
I wonder how many businesses accurately know what their culture is. We were saying earlier on about some businesses do all the talking about they're authentic and they're transparent, but they're probably not, because they just don't walk it. A funny story for you is I won't name this particular business, but at a very senior level one day, the managing director said, "Can anyone here tell me what the culture is of this company?" And he wasn't expecting an answer, and he put his own hand up and he said, "I know what it is." And he said, "Do you know why I know what it is?" He said, "Because I asked the CEO at my interview and he told me." And he said, the CEO basically said to me that our culture here is FIFO. You either fit in or you fuck off. And they all laughed and he laughed. But then he said, "Do you know what? That is our culture." He said, "We don't say FIFO anymore, but we say things like, if you don't want to be on the bus, get off the bus." And then he said to them, "Where do you think culture comes from? It comes from around this table. Who has to change in this organization more than anybody else? We do. So the work starts here." And I sat here that day and thought, wow, this guy means business, because they've just woken up in this room that culture comes from this room, and they're the people who need to change. Thanks, Claire.
You know, David, it's interesting. So having done tons of employee engagement surveys and skip levels and focus groups with the employees, you know, we get feedback from everyone, and I completely agree with what you said. But then I also look around the room, and when I'm talking with our employees, I'm like, every single person that's in this organization creates the culture that we have. And so what are we going to do individually and collectively to create a culture that, you know, puts the customer first, that creates a positive work environment for all of our employees, and that, you know, I think more people enjoy work when it's a fun work environment, right? It's not like, oh, everything has to be rah, 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 but it's like camaraderie. You spend more time with your peers and your teammates than than you do at home, right? And so what are we all doing individually and collectively as leaders and as employees to create the culture and the environment that we want? And we have to make it okay, right? We have to let our organization do that.
Teresa, I wanted to ask you, you've worked for so many different organizations, and I know the cultures that, you know, when we spoke before and heard from you at GWiz, you were talking about how some of your experiences were just, you know, mind-blowing in terms of the culture that you were expected to work under as to now. What's kind of, that's chosen, you know, that's helped you shape your career because you've moved that way. And I guess it's the same for lots of people. If you were in an organization now in a leadership role, is that the first thing you would suggest they change when things aren't going well, when you've gone in and it's failing?
So I guess I couldn't make a statement to say what's the first thing that I'd change, because of course every situation is going to be different. But the culture, and it could be that they have a positive culture, which might be why they called me in, right? So it might be they've decided to do something. But I think, you know, very often, if you've got a strong culture, doesn't mean you won't run into problems, but it does mean that you'll fix them. Whether that fixing means that somebody has to behave differently, or you need to make some tough choices, or you just need to pivot, or you need to get people involved and use all the brains around the table, or whatever it might be. I think a strong, positive culture is going to take you where you want to go. And the culture is going to need to change, right? If you think of what worked in the 50s and then worked in the 80s, didn't work in 2000, didn't work through COVID and the pandemic when people were virtual, doesn't work now as people are coming and we've got disruptors coming at us and we're more global. So I think that, you know, it's also about, as leaders, being aware that part of your culture has to be to keep revisiting and saying, is this the culture that we want today? Because it's might suit somebody else and our culture might not suit somebody else. But is the culture that we have in our business today, to David's point, can we define it? Are we clear on what it is? Are we happy with what it is? And is it going to help us today? And is it going to help us tomorrow? And then if the answers to any of those are no, hopefully your culture is then to do something about it, which it probably is if you're asking the question.
So that part of a good culture is being prepared to go to totally change your culture regularly, or not totally change it, but adjust and iterate and move. You can't just go, we've got a good culture, we're known for it. You have to keep iterating. Is there any way, Marinka's asked that, you know, well, what are your thoughts on how you would measure the success of implementing a strategy on transparency? How can you sort of say, look, we're doing it and it's going well and this is why? How can you do that? Does anyone have an answer to Marinka with a nice deep question there?
I think look at the bottom line, right? How are your profits? Is the company successful, right? Are their clients coming back? Are their customers coming back every day? Are employees showing up and doing what they said they did every day? I know that's not I know it's not a solid measure, right? Which it is hard to measure, how transparent your organization is. You can obviously certainly do surveys and ask people that way, but I think really if you're looking at your bottom line, it should reflect in the numbers.
Yeah, and I would add to that part of that bottom line is, the one layer down from the bottom line is some of the things that contribute to it, right? So if you have a really high client retention, you're going to have a better bottom line because you don't have to spend money losing and regaining customers all the time, right? So what's your client retention like? What's your staff retention like? Right? What's your efficiency and right first time from an operations point of view, right? Those numbers all feed up to that number one kind of bottom line number. But I think that it's looking at the key building blocks of that number because, yes, we're talking about what some people might consider a very soft subject, but that soft subject is only for one reason in business, which is it creates hard results, right? Otherwise, why are you in business? Take your money, stick it in the bank, go home. So, I think that if we measure those key building block components, it'll show us if we're off track and our culture is wrong. It'll show us if our culture is working.
David, the question, and it's come back in a slightly different format, but is what do you advise for leaders who struggle with looking at themselves and taking on advice?
Oh, what a difficult question.
Because we know they're all out there, don't we?
I think again, when we've got to get across and educate that you inspire when you share vulnerability, and that it takes courage to share vulnerability, and we need to show senior leaders examples of other senior leaders who, when they've shown vulnerability, it hasn't been the end of their careers. If anything, they've achieved even more. So this is a generational thing. It's absolutely generational. People of my generation, we would not have shown what we would perceive as weakness many years ago in our careers. So I think it's about trying to give them examples of that talking about your struggles in life can actually define you and actually take you forward. HSBC Bank, they had a very senior director was off for 6 months with depression. And when he got back after his 6 months, fairly soon afterwards, he was promoted to an even bigger job within the bank. And that was brilliant because it gave a brilliant example to everybody within HSBC that you can struggle with mental health, for example, and come back from this and actually go on and have an even more successful career. We just need lots and lots of other senior leaders, examples of how it's really helped them, I think is the best way of answering that.
Can I give an example as well? And it's not, I'm not taking this one from more of that from a mental health perspective, more just from when leaders are just struggling, looking at themselves and taking advice from others. My husband is a fixed ops director in automotive, and mentor and trainer and really build strong service departments and capability in his team and the service managers that are around him. But he had one of his managers that was struggling taking advice from others. And so he's like, hey, come with me for a second. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend this everywhere, but he's like, come into the restroom with me. And he's like, look in the mirror. He's like, the only person that can solve this problem is staring right back at you. Right. And so it's a pretty blunt, bold example of sometimes you just kind of got to hit people in the face with it, right? And in this case, it was like, look at your face staring back at you in the mirror. The only person that can solve this, the only person that's going to be able to help you is yourself, right? Because we've given you all the tools, we've given you the resources, we're kind of at a crossroads, right, at this point. And to his credit, to his employees' credit, he turned it around. He's like, okay, he needed that moment for someone just to really say, all right, you're right, it is me, and I do need to do things differently.
And Claire, if I could just add one piece,
Yeah.
I do quite a lot of transformation work, which includes a lot of change. And I'd say the best salesman in an organization ever is a peer. And the reason I say that is because when I say to people, here's all the reasons why you should change. They're like, yeah, but you have a vested interest. Your job is to change this organization, right? When HR go and say, here's all the reasons you should change. It's like, yeah, but that's your job to tell me those sorts of things. So if you can find a peer in or outside the company who has done it and present them with somebody who can basically give empirical evidence in a conversational way that says, I know it sounds crazy. I know you don't believe what she's telling you or what have you, but I did it. And here's what happened. And here's what happened, the good and the bad and the ugly and the scary, right? And here's how I handled it. It's the most powerful way to sell a new idea that I've ever found.
So piggybacking on that too, right? So when you're doing, a talent review with all of your leadership team, I'm always looking for the other leaders to say, to bring up positive feedback, positive, constructive, all of it around my team members. Because if they're speaking on behalf of my team, I don't have to, right? Because they're sharing, and to your point, right? It really has such a greater impact because everyone's like, yeah, I do. I see that. And you're like, okay, my case is done here, right?
Yeah, so you've got to find who people want to hear it from, because you can all be telling the truth, but people only want to hear it from a certain source, don't they? So look, we've got a few minutes left. It would be I'd be remiss of me not to say to you, do you want to share one point each that you really kind of think is the key thing here, then, for either how to boost transparency, or why transparency is important, that you think this is the key thing I want to get across today? I'm going to give you one last chance to formulate it. David, can I come to you first?
Yeah, can I talk about that being kind at work isn't being soft? Let me go back to what I said earlier about lowering the bar. When you're kinder to yourself, you will achieve more. You're not going soft on yourself. You're actually going to get your mindset in a state where you're going to become more creative and more productive. And if we can replicate that across businesses and not push and push and push and push, but actually care more and be more authentic and kinder and more transparent, this topic will drive performance. You'll get the very best out of your people. And I would always argue that you'll only get the best out of your people when you get the culture right at work. So that's probably my key message, Claire. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Teresa, can I come to you?
Yeah, I'd say, I'm just going to repeat what we talked earlier, which is we're in business to build a business and make money for lots of people, the society, everything else. So the reason why we're talking about doing this isn't just because it's a nice subject and it makes people feel good and it'll bring a smile to people's face. It'll do all of those things. But if you're struggling with, is it worth the effort? Then look at the numbers of the companies that do this well, right? It's absolutely a business imperative. And with modern business and technology and globalization, that makes it so much easier for disruptors and new companies to knock older, more established companies off their perch. It's definitely an imperative. We can't say, well, we're one of the stalwarts and therefore we don't need to play that game. That's for the new kind of kids coming on the block. So yeah, look at the numbers. It's a business imperative. It's not a nice to have. And it'll make you feel better.
And you'll enjoy work more. Exactly. Jen.
Yeah. Turning it back a bit, I guess, if you're not transparent with yourself, with your employees, with your customers, what are you hiding, right? You're giving people permission to not trust you. And that's the opposite of engagement, right? And the unintended consequences can result in a rapidly toxic work environment. And so I think it goes back to that, focus on the problem, not the person. And just showing up, being present. I love the whole conversation earlier around vulnerability, and it's okay. It's okay to be vulnerable, right? And it's okay to show where you failed and what you've learned from those failures, and helping your organization know that that's okay too. Because the more that we fail faster, right, the more quickly we can learn and we can move forward, and that just really leads itself to driving an engaging work environment. So just be, do your best to be transparent with yourself. It's okay, and it's okay not to be perfect every single day. Nobody is, right? And I think one of the mantras that I've said in the past too is like, sometimes we get uncomfortable talking with different people, or there's an intimidation of talking with a senior leader. We just have to remind ourselves that they're people too. Nobody's going to die as a result of that conversation.
Thank you very much. There's been some lovely comments as well here. That Leanne McAvoy says, workplace meritocracy. As courageous leaders, when we hold safe places, or when we are safe spaces, others will follow. And then I just felt you need to hear this, Jennifer. Nancy Steinberg says, you look damn good for 6 a.m. And I know you had a stressful time getting there and getting to your seats.
9 flights of stairs this morning.
And she's done her steps already. 9 flights of stairs. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for sharing your insights. Really fascinating. We are going to be continuing these conversations from the GWIS Summit. So I think our next one is August the 14th is our next installment. And we're going to hear from the diversity specialist at the Equality Group, James Hare. Really kind of on the same way, but it's also like how we are stifling people's transparency and feeling safe, well, particularly with minorities, and how actually if we celebrate and value them, the difference that will make to the workplace. So I look forward to that. Thank you for joining us all today, and we'll see you next month. Thank you very much.
See everybody. Bye.